Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Dulles Church. I'm Christina Bartz, and I'm looking forward to sharing some updates with you this morning. Number one, chili kits. We did it! We've collected over 70 chili kits to feed our neighbors, the Dulles South Food Pantry. Today's the last day for collecting kits, and it's not too late to drop off your kits at our South Riding and Aldi locations. Check out our website and app for details or reach out to me via email with questions. Number two, after all your hard work, we wanted to celebrate our church family coming together to feed our neighbors by feeding one another at a chili cook-off. Everyone's invited to join us on February 13th for a fun time together and a chili cook-off competition right after our Sunday gathering at Lightridge. We're still looking for 4 to 5 more chili entries and some help with desserts. Sign-up details are on our website and app. Third, I'm super excited to share that we're starting a new group for moms led by our amazing Amy Russell. She will be leading this group every other Monday, starting tomorrow, and it's not too late to join. If you're interested in joining, sign up on our app or let us know out in the lobby after the gathering. Last but not least, thank you so much for your generosity in giving in 2021. We've emailed donation reports for your records, and if you've not received your letter or have questions, please contact me at christinab@dulleschurch.org. Well, that's all, folks. Have a great Sunday. I'm so happy you're here. See you later.
If you are not in the Dulles area, if you're somewhere else in the country watching, it is cold here in the Dulles area this weekend. Hey, welcome to everybody, wherever you're watching from. Amy had planned to be here with me for this final part of our Can't Relate series. And I want to thank her. I believe, has done a great job. She was super nervous about this. A while back when we were talking about the possibility of the series, she said, I do want to do this series with you. There's some things I'd like to say. She was really nervous. She sings in front of people, but she doesn't like to talk in front of people. I just think she did great. She was planning to be here. She tested positive for COVID, not this past week, the week before. She's been really busy catching up on preschool work, getting ready to be back with the kiddos tomorrow. So I told her, I think actually this is a good time for me to share a lot of thoughts in my assessment of the pandemic. We're almost to 2 years. We're almost to the 2-year point of when the pandemic started here in the United States. And I said, I think this is a great time for me to, at the end of this series, just open up about some of my thoughts. And there's so much I want to say. I actually, just an hour ago, I grayed out another 2 blocks of my notes. I did some of that yesterday. I've just been feeling God kind of stir in me and direct me to not make this as long as I thought it would be. Actually shorten it, keep it to really the focus. I don't want my tone to be complaining or certainly not judging. That the point of this is to be unifying. That's actually the point of what I've been wrestling with for a couple months now, in just talking openly about how I think we as a country have done with the pandemic. There's a lot I had planned to say about both administrations, about how President Trump handled almost exactly 1 year of the pandemic, how President Biden handled almost exactly 1 year of the pandemic. There's just a lot that I think will put us in the weeds if I open up about my assessment of both. I guess my short summary of how both administrations have handled the virus and the pandemic and communication, just clear communication's been a failure. I think with President Biden, his approval rating, not just in general, but in handling of the pandemic, dropped more this past week. He's now been below 50% in his handling of the pandemic, I think for 10 or 12 days now. There's been division among Democrats and even in his own administration and how the CDC has been communicating changes and recommendations. I think President Trump and all that could be said or assessed about President Trump's handling, all those press conferences. And, I think the biggest concern that I have looking back is how, on the one hand, he seemed to mock the necessity of a vaccine, and then within hours would be sort of boasting about Operation Warp Speed, and even promising that the vaccine would be out by Thanksgiving. And then another day later, he'd be sort of mocking the need for the vaccine again. I just found that very confusing. I think it was super confusing for just everyday people, parents, just trying to figure out how to think about this for their kids, or how people process mRNA. And now, for at least a month, former President Trump's been urging people to get the vaccine and get boosted. There's just been so much confusion. My assessment of both administrations is that they've shown that we weren't prepared, and we still aren't prepared for handling something like this, and even how to communicate to the country about this. News agencies, there's a long section. I had to gray out a big chunk of it today. It was just going to take too much time. How our news has, I think, it's no secret that our news in general is sensational. Obviously, we know that. It's been a tactic of news agencies for decades. I have followed, among probably 10 or 15 news agencies regularly, daily, weekly. One is NBC Nightly News. My favorite, I've said for years, my favorite evening news anchor is Lester Holt. I've been DVRing Lester Holt every single night for, I don't know, I'm going to say 10 or 12 years, maybe more, whenever he took over for Brian Williams. And as an example, just a sort of a microcosm to my assessment of the news, as Omicron was spiking and we were nearing the hospitalization record just a few weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I saw this happen. I don't even fault Lester Holt specifically for this. It was really just the NBC Nightly News. How the first 3.5 to 4 minutes, almost every night that week, would focus on the hospitalization record being broken from the year prior. And I was waiting and waiting night after night for the context to be stated that we know that ICU rates are nowhere near what they were. In fact, Omicron is not putting anybody. South Africa told us 2 or 3 months ago, Omicron wasn't putting anybody in ICU. And yet, the way the wording, the way the opening news hook was written or scripted sounded on par compared to last year with the same stress load on hospitals. Now, if they had led with nurses are overwhelmed and doctors are overwhelmed, our hospitals infrastructure are overwhelmed, that I think would have been an appropriate lead. But to leave out multiple nights, and then there was one particular night where after the 3.5 or 4 minute mark of the opening story, there was like a one-liner about how, fewer people are in ICUs and many fewer vents are being used. We know that number's almost zero with Omicron. Fox News does this, CNN does it. The breaking. Fox News uses breaking news so many times throughout the day. And CNN does it maybe as many times. And listen, today isn't about news agencies. This is just it's supposed to be a quick point about how our news agencies haven't learned that negativity has such a low effect of morale on our country. The opposite is true. Our news agencies have been emboldened from what social media platforms have told us. Empirical data shows us without a doubt from social media platforms that negative themes or stories, critiquing, complaining kinds of social media stories result in a much higher engagement, social media engagement, and returned engagement. And our news agencies are just feeding off that data and leading with so much negativity. I think our news agencies have failed in often not giving hope or good news where it was appropriate and where we've actually, hey, we've made progress, or Omicron isn't nearly as dangerous. I mean, we know that now. I think a month ago, it would have been really clear to take the data from South Africa and other countries and make that really clear. I think it's fed a lot of the fear, a lot of the confusion. You know, I was thinking about assessing or grading in this test. I really do believe, I said this in my email this week, that about a month after the 2 weeks of flattening the curve, remember we were all like, we're going to shut down for 2 weeks? How will our economy survive that? How do we even... Yeah, it was about a month later, I talked to a good friend who's worked in epidemiology, specifically in Liberia with Ebola. And he said to me before April was over, April 2020, like we weren't even a month or 5 or 6 weeks into this. And he said, Brad, I'm telling you, this isn't ending at the end of May or the end of June. He said, what I'm hearing in epidemiology is we've got till September to get this under control, or we're going to go into fall. If we go into fall with it, you know, and I hadn't heard anybody say this in the news, we could, and he ended up using music concerts. He said, not only do I think it's possible we won't have any music concerts anymore in 2020, I think it's possible we won't have any in 2021. And I was like, what? Seriously? You really believe that? And I came away from some of those early conversations believing, just a month or two into this, that this is actually a test. We're about to be tested as a country, as a society. Our character is going to be tested, our drive for unity, our clarity. And I think we've pretty much failed as a country. I think I thought about assessing conservatives and liberals, and that's gotten super confusing. Conservatives in the past 2 or 3 months, to me, pundits that I read, that I see on television in DC, around the country, even here in the Dulles area, just conservatives that I know I've been in conversations with, have sounded, ironically, more and more like liberals from 18 months ago, and they don't even realize it. They don't even realize they're sounding this way or that their tone has changed. I've heard so many conservatives in the last couple months cite science and data about how few people are in ICUs. The numbers are clear. And I've actually challenged a couple of friends, not here in our church community, but friends in conversations on the phone or around the country who are conservative, and we're using numbers. Like the data is showing us that Omicron isn't having the same effect as Delta. And I challenged a couple of them and said, hey, where was your concern about numbers back during Delta? Why weren't you prioritizing the science? It's amazing how reversed things have become. I have seen and heard liberals, and I don't even think I can say liberals, just people who highly touted the the vaccine, who have sounded less sure about the vaccine, who've been suggesting to me, I mean, all over the place, but even in conversations to me, friends have said, yeah, I think maybe our kids should be back home for a little while. This is going back the past month and a half. And I've said, well, but you've told me that you're vaccinated. Yeah, but it's such a confusing conversation. And I've said, wait, what is your concern? Are you concerned that Omicron is going to have a negative effect? And in the couple of cases where I actually kind of pushed this out a little bit, like, well, what is your concern? Because you've been so confident in the vaccine, they couldn't even explain to me the core of their fear. Their inner sense just told them, I think we need to pull back again. We need to, shelter again. We need to be uber safe and careful again. I asked a few people, are you concerned about getting the sore throat? Amy just had Omicron. She just had, she was positive for COVID. She had a really sore throat for 2 days. A couple more days later in the evening, she'd feel really fatigued and tired. I I've asked some people, is your fear, like, are you afraid of getting some of these symptoms? And they've said, well, I don't know if it's that. Well, if it's not that, do you believe the science still that most people getting it today are asymptomatic? And it's just been super confusing how people don't even hold to their views from a year ago. So I don't even know how to assess liberal or conservative handling of the pandemic. What I'll say is this. I believe, generally speaking, I'm generalizing here, the side, if we can even understand the sides anymore, the side that has tended to be very pro-vaccine. And you could say, there was a day where you could say, well, that was the liberal side. I don't even know if you can say that anymore. I believe has really skewed toward fear. I have heard and seen a gripping fear where in the name of preserving life, that's where this all started. 2 years ago, I was completely on board. I think so much of the country was on board with preserving life, those who are vulnerable. The data is showing us from France and Italy and different parts of the world that we really need to be concerned about those over 65 years old or those who have, we know this. It's amazing to me how many conversations I've had, how many people I've seen interviewed, how many people I've read who voiced beyond concern about the vulnerable, fear. Just fear. They're not even sure they can articulate their fear. When asked specifically, are you afraid someone in your house is going to die? So many will say, well, no, I don't think so. It's such an ambiguous fear, but I've seen, I'm going to say the side that tends to be vaccinated, who tends to be, I'd say, more politically liberal, absolutely gripped beyond fear for the vulnerable, fear for their own personal safety, so much so that they're trading one version of preserving life for the version of no longer living their lives, where people have just stopped living because fear has taken over them. Now, in assessing what would have been the other side, I'm going to really kind of lump this, and this is really to the heart of what I want to talk about today, which is really more of Christianity. And I know I had that provocative line in my email this week. And by the way, if you don't get my weekly email, just let us know. Let us know through the app or our website. We'd love to add you to our email list. I send out an email about once a week. I use that provocative line that I give Christianity an F in this test. And I want to explain that a little bit here because it gets to the heart of where I really want to go. I want this to be unifying. And we're going to look at something that Jesus has said here that I think is going to be challenging to all of us. And I really believe it's going to be inspiring. But first, my assessment of how Western Christianity has handled this pandemic. And at the risk of sounding prideful, I hope I don't sound prideful. I'm so honored, having gone through this pandemic, of being a part of this church with you. I really believe have handled this so well. Even those who lean right of center or lean left of center at Dulles have just not brought division, not only into our walls or into our spaces and our gatherings. I just don't believe you're living out division. I have said numerous times that, and it's easy for a white man to say this today, I guess. I have said our country's not been this divided since the Civil War. And I didn't live through the civil rights. I was born in 70. I didn't live through the civil rights movement. I will say without a doubt, I've never seen our country this divided, not in my lifetime. And I'm just so proud and honored to be a part of this church with you because I haven't seen it in our church. I have not seen anyone in our church be divisive or combative with the other side of whatever you believe. And so my assessment here is really about Western Christianity and just how heartbreaking I found the response of Christians. I stopped using, a lot of you know this, I stopped using the description of Christian for myself 15 years ago, maybe more now. I call myself a follower of Jesus. And if that seems like a semantics mind game or some kind of trick, the semantics matter to me. Long ago in our country, at least a generation ago, Christianity began meaning in large part a political worldview. And a lot of the view of the church's movement was in alignment with, and in this case, conservative values and a Republican political platform. I love that we have Republicans and conservatives in our church. It's not about the political view, it's the attachment of the political view to the work of Jesus, to the activity of Jesus in this world, as if what Jesus really cares about is defending and protecting and speaking out for conservative views. And I have seen in this pandemic so much of Christianity, so many who call themselves Christians, be most passionate about their own personal, individual American freedom or liberty. And here's the big problem I have with that personally, is not only is it not a New Testament view, but if you read the gospel accounts of Jesus' life and teaching and what he lived and modeled, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's the opposite of what Jesus calls us to when he calls us to follow him. He calls us to give up our own rights, our own lives. He calls us to take up our cross. If we're going to follow him, we take up our cross. We give up our lives. We give up, in many cases, our wants or our right to be right. And I want to spend the end of this relationship series looking at the center, the core of what I believe the church should be. I believe God's church had a monumental opportunity during this pandemic to put in front of the world a completely different paradigm. Not a conservative or liberal paradigm, not what Fauci or Trump believe or where they're wrong, a completely different transcendent view of what our world really needs, what our world is desperate for, to see in somebody or to hear in someone's voice. And I believe Jesus spoke it with his own voice 2,000 years ago. And those who are called to follow him are to live this out. And I'm going to sum it all up with a very soft sounding word. I might even lose some of you by using this word. It just sounds so almost like little butterflies should be flying around this word, the word agape. Jesus used a provocative word in the Greek language, agape, to refer to a new kind of love that he was bringing to this world. And it wasn't a feeling-based kind of love. See, English, one of the tragedies about the English language is its handling of the word love. It's actually very sloppy what English does with the word love. We basically sum up all different types of emotions or different versions or types of love into one word, one four-letter word. In Greek, there's so many different words unrelated to one another to refer to different types of love. In English, you can love your grandma, and you can love Moose Tracks ice cream, and you can love the Washington Commanders. And I'm not there yet. I loved my grandmother's, and I love Moose Tracks ice cream. I do not love the Washington Commanders yet. Maybe I'll get there. We have this feeling-based understanding of love where the same expression that you would use for hot dogs or ice cream or pizza, we use for people. Even falling in love. When falling in love is described by most Westerners, it's usually a feeling that's described. When someone says, well, when I fell in love, they usually then talk out or explain a feeling. Jesus introduces this word. In the Greek language, it's the word agape. And it is radically different than what anybody has been modeling. And when I say anybody, I just mean our agencies and our government and states and the news and journalism has been modeling in our country. No one's come close to this. It's so radically different. And it's so what our world is craving. And so I'm just going to put this in front of you again, and I'm going to call you to join me. Not that I do this perfectly, but I've devoted my life to chasing the way of Jesus. As hard or challenging as this is, there's no other way. There's just no other option. When it's introduced to you and it grips your heart and you're convinced that this is the way, there's just nothing that compares. Everything else is just settling. And so again today, I'm going to call you to join me in this idea, and it begins in Matthew 22. Jesus is asked, so what is the most important command? If you're saying, Jesus, that you've only brought one law here, after all the laws of Moses and all the rules of religion, and even in the Old Testament, what do you sum up the most important law to be? And Jesus says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. In other words, with every part of you. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. He uses the word agape. The Greek word was agape for love. Love God with every part of your being and love your neighbors yourself. This is not a feeling-based love. This is not a sentiment that you even necessarily prioritize in a verbal sense. This is love acted out. It's love put in action. It is a living out, extending out from yourself in action version of love. So we could ask, well, which one is more important? Is it loving God with every part of our being or loving our neighbor? And Jesus couples these together, in essence, to put them on the same side of the coin. You can't love God. You actually are not a follower of Jesus, practically speaking, if you're not loving your neighbor, extending action-centered love toward your neighbor. So Jesus doesn't prioritize one or the other. He intentionally puts it in front of us so that we would understand if you aren't loving, and we're going to get to the certain kinds of people that we extend action-centered love toward, that we actually live out and express love in action toward. If we're not living that out towards others, we're not loving him. We're not actually in relationship with him. Jesus transcends this even further when he tells us the type of person. Now, there's the story of the Good Samaritan. I actually chose not to read that today, where he actually defines what love is. It's the enemy. It's the despised who actually is the one, the Samaritan who actually shows love and pays money and uses his own resources to take the hurting to the clinic to get medical attention, and who shows sympathy and care. I want to look at a different text in Luke where Jesus shows us like a different level version of love that he calls us to. This is the love in us that we offer in action toward people that we don't like very much. We just don't like them. And people that we actually think aren't deserving. He brings into the picture and says, this is the target of your love. You don't love me. You're not in relationship with me if you're not extending and acting out, expressing love toward people that you actually don't like very much, and people that you might, if you were honest and actually spoke it out loud, would say they may not deserve it. Luke chapter 6, if you lend things to people, that sounds benign, but Jesus is actually talking about action. If you actually give something that belongs to you to someone else, it's your possession, it's your resources, your money, even in terms of lending. If you lend things to people, always hoping to get something back, what praise should you get? Even scoundrels lend to other scoundrels so that they'll get something back, or the same amount, or even something in return, maybe even interest. But love your enemies, Jesus says. Do good to them and lend to them without hoping to get anything back. Then you will have a great reward, and you will be children of the Most High God, because he is kind even to people who are ungrateful and full of sin. Now, when Jesus says love your enemies, this is who he means. He specifically means, and we see it in the Good Samaritan, we see this, the woman at the well, we see it in many cases, we see it with the Roman soldiers who crucify him on the cross. We see it consistently over and over again. Enemy means the person who believes differently than you, who votes differently than you, and who prays differently than you. I mean, in our terms, especially here during the pandemic, that is a really good Western way of summarizing what Jesus literally meant when he teaches us to love. Not say, okay, I'll think about them, or I'll say a prayer for a few seconds about this person over here, the person who thinks ridiculous political thoughts that are so unbelievable. I'm actually going to live out. I'm going to move in action. I'm going to get in my car and drive to. I'm going to actually lend to. I'm going to show up at their house. I'm going to have coffee with. I'm going to be a friend and a listening ear to. I'm going to live out agape, action expressed love to my enemies, to those who believe differently than me, to those who vote differently than me, to those who pray differently than I do. This is the kind of love, this kind of love is the very picture Jesus gives us of God's own love, of how he loves us. Jesus he doesn't just talk about it, he did it every day toward the poor, toward the sinful, the notorious sinners that we're told. The Pharisees, the religious leaders were so upset with him for loving unclean people, people who were in awful habits. He asked Matthew, a tax collector, a despised, self-consumed, cheating all of the public, skimming off the top tax collector, to be one of his disciples. Peter was a mess. Peter was a loudmouth, opinionated mess. Jesus calls him to follow him, to be one of his disciples. Jesus loves the broken. He entered homes. He washed the feet of the dirty and imperfect people. He lived this out. But here's the ultimate of Jesus showing us what agape love is that when the Jewish people expected the Messiah to overthrow the oppressors, the Roman Empire was essentially almost enslaving the Jewish people in first century Palestine and Judea. And the Jewish people were convinced the Messiah would come and overthrow Rome. Not only does Jesus associate the arrogant religious leaders who are not demonstrating true love, the love of God's kingdom, they're nowhere close to agape love. They're only loving their own kind for their own political gain, their own power. When Jesus exposes that among the Pharisees and essentially equates them to the Roman government, he doesn't then attempt to overthrow them. You get halfway through each of the Gospels, and the momentum is suggesting Jesus is going to overthrow the Pharisees. He's going to overthrow Rome. He shockingly allows them to overthrow him. And this is something that I believe Western Christianity is just not modeling today. It's not in our tone. I kid you not, just yesterday, I sat in a restaurant here in the area by myself, going over notes for this message today, and I overhear a couple of men, never seen them before. They're talking about church and a Bible study. I could hear a little bit. I wasn't really eavesdropping. I was close to their table, and I could just hear they're talking about a Bible study in their church. And I was thinking, oh, cool. I might introduce myself and say, hey, I'm a pastor. Good for you guys. Where do you go to church? And before I got to that point, one of the men said to the other, listen, I'm hoping you can encourage. It was the younger man saying to the older man, I hope you can encourage pastor, whoever the pastor is. I didn't hear his name. I don't know where they go to church. I've just had it up to here with people who are all about the vaccines and and he goes into this rant. And it's not that he was expressing his opinion. It was the tone. It was the tone of disgust. I've had it. I can't deal with them. I can't even. And I'm paraphrasing here, and I don't want to be unfair. I doubt this person will ever know I said this or doesn't know me. I don't know him. It was a tone that I've heard thousands of times the last couple of years from Christians who fill churches everywhere. This disgust or impatience. And it always comes down to the church should be protecting Americans and their individual rights. And Jesus led the story to the point of allowing Rome, allowing the enemy to actually overthrow him, or so it seemed. And in Jesus' kingdom, being overthrown still has redemption and resurrection coming. It's always coming. When we allow our enemies to hurt us, it's not that we just lay down and we let people harm our families. It's not that. It's giving up your right to be right in order to serve others. That's what Jesus did. Jesus didn't just let people overthrow him. He allowed them to hurt him for the sake of protecting others, for the sake of rescuing others, for the sake of serving others. That was the point of his death. Resurrection is always the final part of the story in God's kingdom, however you're treated, however you're looked at. And it's my generalization of the American church. I'm generalizing here. It just seems that we've completely lost this. We somehow think that Jesus' priority is to uphold our individual liberties. And Jesus has called us to lay down our lives for our enemy, for the person who thinks differently than you. Extend love, be the friend. Maybe you are the person who they can actually open up to about the divorce or the hurt or their frustrations, or maybe you're never going to agree politically, but you're going to find a friend and you're going to be a friend and you're going to be hope and you're going to end up being able to tell your own story of brokenness and hurt and how you found life and love from God. During this pandemic, where has the consistent, unmistakable heart of Jesus been? That sounds something like this. Romans chapter 5, verse 8. God demonstrated his own agape for us in this: while we were still sinners, the Messiah died for us. The focus here is on the we. While we were broken, while we were in need, Jesus gave up his life. While we were selfish, that's what sinful means. Sinful means selfish toward God. We make ourselves God. We don't allow him to be God. We choose selfishly to be God. While we were living and choosing that, he came to die for us. 1 John 4:9, God's own agape was revealed when he sent his one and only Son into the world so that through him we could have life. And so John tells us a couple verses later, it all comes down to this, 1 John 4:11. Beloved ones, if that is how God has loved us, then we should show love for one another. Agape, love in action, love that's expressed out in what we give, in the time that we give up, in who we go to, who we sit, who we sacrifice our resources and time and energy for. This is where healthy relationships begin. This is the core of healthy relationships, is allowing the agape love of Jesus to change your past, your worldview, your anger, your attitude towards others, and then you allowing it to be expressed, that same love expressed toward others, not others who are like you, others who are opposed to you or think differently than you. The world will see and know, Jesus told us in his prayer before the cross, the world will see and know his reality in us when we love, when we live out agape, when we actually put it into action. All right, here's two closing things I just want to put in front of you. First of all, just stop right now for just a moment. Who right now in your life, at work, in your neighborhood, maybe a relative or family member, who do you need to love? Not feel love toward, but actually act out love toward right now. Don't end today without identifying who that person is. And don't go through this coming week without acting out love for that person. Who cares how they vote? Who cares what they think politically? They are a child of God who needs Jesus' love in you to be expressed toward them. Here's the second challenge, is 1 Corinthians 8. I don't know how to coerce or convince you to read it. I'm just asking you, as your pastor, this week, read 1 Corinthians chapter 8. It is the closest thing that I can see or identify in the New Testament to masks. Masks or no masks, it has to do with meat that's been sacrificed to idols and what followers of Jesus believe. Some believe that it's sinful to eat that meat, and others, like Paul, are completely fine saying, thank you, God, for this food, and eating the meat. Read what Paul says about that controversy and ask God to show you how you are to respond toward others as a result. Ask God to show you where you are in 1 Corinthians 8 and where he is and how it plays out in your life. Okay, I'm going to use that as our closing prayer. I love you guys so much. The core of relationships, healthy relationships in our lives, begins with allowing the agape love of Jesus to permeate every part of us, so much so that we actually live it out. Have a good week, everybody.